What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Hot List. I'm your host, Matt Johnson with Keller Realty. And in the Hot List, we talk about real estate topics and questions. I answer a question of the day that is submitted by a listener of the podcast and or a previous client that has asked a question. And if you have a real estate question, you're not sure where to begin, I would love to be the real estate resource that you reach out to, start with. Hopefully, by answering that question for you, that can springboard you forward and finding the answer. Now, whether you are catching this live as I come to you Monday through Friday around 12 o'clock Central Standard Time, or listening to this on YouTube or your podcast player of choice, please don't forget to like, subscribe. Make sure you leave me a review. I would love to get some feedback from y'all in the comments as well. So make sure that you do that and keep all of that coming. And with the question of the day, I don't go into a great amount of detail because every situation is a little bit different. These are just a question and an answer that will scratch the surface and get you, like I said, as a springboard to the next step. And with each question I answer, like I said, if you have a question, please feel free to answer. Please feel free to ask it to me, whether it's on Facebook or podcasts that you're listening to. Just drop it in the comments. And I will not only get that question answered for you, I will use that for future episodes just like this one, because if you have that question, the chance that somebody else has that question is extremely high. Maybe they don't know where to start. Maybe it's a question that I haven't thought of or been asked before. So please make sure you keep those coming. And I can't do this without you. So thank you so much. Now, the question of the day today is kind of, you could almost be like a follow-up question to an episode that we talked about just a couple weeks ago. And for that reason, I have actually included the link to that, since these could be used together. I've included the YouTube link to that as well as the Spotify link to that. Because the question of the day, how do I paint over dark walls? And that is a great question and can be a whole lot of work, especially if you have or had a red kitchen like I did. Let me tell you, that was something, just dealing with that, especially with all the prep work. So before we get too far into it, congratulations, whether it's because you decided to paint or just purchased a home and closed on it and ready to move in. Congrats. First and foremost, I want to say that for this particular question and scenario, I'm going to be approaching this as a new homeowner that has just closed and ready to paint the the house that they just closed on. And the reason I'm doing that is because that's who's asked the question. The same tips will apply to current homeowners, but just in this intro portion of it, and you'll hear me reference it a little bit throughout, these are going to be geared towards either first-time home buyers or newer home buyers. And I'm sure everybody has heard, maybe you've been told, maybe your agent told you, maybe I told you as an agent, it's just paint, which is absolutely true. It is purely cosmetic and can be handled accordingly. Now, here's where the story differs a little bit. While it is only paint, it is dark paint. So it's still true that dark paint can be remedied. Again, I had a dark red kitchen that is now gray, so it still can be remedied and painted over. It's just a different story converting dark walls to much lighter walls, especially if you have dark colors like reds, purples, browns, or maybe even a darker gray, or honestly anything that has a lot of pigment in it. And uh, it can still be a challenge if it's not done correctly. So what we're going to talk about when I answer how do I paint over dark walls, today we're going to talk about 3 tips when painting over dark colors. So if you have had this question yourself, maybe you have had somebody, family, friend, coworker that has asked you, make sure you send this to them. Like this, tag them, share this out, and let them know that there is hope and there are some answers. Tip number 1 is probably the most important. Primer is not optional. As I just mentioned, anything with a pigment can be a challenge. And this is especially true if you skip the prep work and don't do it properly. Many people think painting is just painting, which again is true. Keep in mind the end result is going to be directly related to how well you do the prep work. For example, it's going to be similar to laying tile or installing a new bathroom sink. The amount of prep time put into repainting dark walls is going to show at the end once you're done. The right amount of prep work will make the job not only easier, but something that you can look forward to once you've completed it, because you're going to be able to see the physical change from the dark color that it was to the color it is now, whether it's a lighter color or a different shade. The big key when prepping for dark colors, like I mentioned, primer is not optional. I unfortunately learned this the hard way over the years, and was just something that I didn't think was a big deal. Turns out, kind of a big deal. Even with paints, it can be even a big deal with paints claiming they have a built-in primer, which is typically just a thicker paint. Some of them don't actually have a primer built into it. It's just a thicker blend or type of paint. And this will may work and it may not. So to counteract dark colors, you actually will need a high quality primer. So don't buy the cheapest thing possible. You want something that you know is going to hold up and do the trick. Also, when choosing a primer, choose one that is specifically designed to block pigment bleeding, and especially if you're going from a huge coloring spectrum. So there's a greater color difference between the paint being covered and the paint that you're covering it with. More primer is going to be needed. On darker walls, plan for at least 2 coats. On our kitchen that we did that went from red to gray, we put at least 3 coats on there. Tip number 2, choose colors in the same family. While this isn't a huge deal, if you're just wanting to lighten the color that's in there, this is going to be the option for you. So if you don't like the color that's on the wall right now, and you're thinking, maybe it's just 1 to 2 shades too dark, this is an easier problem to solve by choosing a lighter color than if you went from like a midnight blue to like an Arctic white. That's 2 color ends of the spectrum, and that's not easy to do, because taming that shade of color is going to be much easier if you stay within the same family. You're only going to have small amounts of pigment bleed through, and that can easily go unnoticed if you're going from like like the dark gray that I have in my office right now is a like a pewter gray, and at some point we're going to go to a light French gray. Um, we'll still prime it, but we don't have to do it as much because it's still within the same family and going to a lighter shade of gray. So with doing that, you'll still need to stay close to the same shade if you are wanting to do a complete change. So if I end up doing like a green or a blue instead of another shade of gray in the office here, I will revert back to tip number one and prime like my life depends on it. Also, as a quick side note, depending on your spouse, um, it just might your life just might depend on it. I'm just saying, babe, if you're watching this, I'm obviously not talking about you. I'm talking about, you know, other spouses, not you at all. Love you. But even if you stay with the same family or similar shade color, I would still recommend priming. It may just take fewer coats or lighter coats, so you could get away with just a standard primer and not like an industrial strength primer. And finally, tip number three, and the reason that I how much included the previous episode of how much paint to buy in the description: paint more than you think you should. Again, I've linked that episode in the description, so make sure you check that out if you want to know how much paint you should buy and why it's a good idea to buy more paint than you need, because this is a huge mistake a lot of homeowners make when they apply new paint besides skipping the primer. They actually stop before they should. So they actually stop painting before they're done. And with some colors, this can be tricky. It can be really tough to tell if you're actually finished. But if you walk along the walls and you see any thin spots, I would definitely recommend applying another coat. I would say the chances are good that if you find one thin spot, there's gonna be others. Typically, two coats are gonna be enough to get the job done. However, with darker colors, like I mentioned, the reds, the purples, the browns, the darker grays, it may take three or even four coats. Remember, my kitchen that was a darker red, it was uh, about it was a similar color, if not darker than a burgundy red. That took every bit of three coats, and those weren't thin coats. I mean, we slapped that primer on there. I've even heard and talked to professional painters that because of the natural light that was in the house that day, when they finished, everything looked good. Didn't look like there was any thin coats. But when they were doing another room a couple days later, they noticed that there was some bleeding from either the primer or the previous color. So they ended up having to put a third coat on, 2, 3, maybe even 4 days later. And, it's easy to overpaint, uh, and it's easy to quit before it's done, especially if it's a weekend project, because you're in a hurry. You've given yourself the weekend to get it all done, and you want to call it good and clean everything up before the paint dries. Well, while I absolutely understand, I've been there myself, this is not the time to try to rush through it and just think that two coats are going to be enough when it may actually take three. So just be aware of that, and know that you might start it Saturday, get it done Sunday, and may need to apply yet a third coat on Monday or Tuesday. So those are the three tips when painting over dark colors. Again, number one, the most important one on the list, I cannot stress enough, primer is not optional. If you skip prep work with the primer, there's a chance that those darker colors, that pigment is going to bleed through on the new paint, or only if you only put one coat of primer on there, it's not worth it. Primer is cheap. Just paint at least 2 coats, if not a third one on there. Tip number 2, if you want to lighten the color, just choose a color in the same family. So if you're thinking that the color is just 1 or 2 shades too dark, if you stay within that same color, you may be able to get away with just painting and not having to prime everything. However, if you're going from one extreme to another, like in my case, we went from a dark burgundy to a light gray. That was an extreme change. We put 3 coats of primer, and it's, just the route we felt safest with. So if you're going to stay within the same color family, it is possible to get away. A little bit of pigment is going to bleed through and it may go unnoticed. But if you're not going to stay within the same shade color, just prime like your life depends on it. And if your spouse is like mine, it just might. I'm just kidding, babe. It's a joke. Love you. And finally, tip number 3, paint more than you think you should. Again, I've linked that episode to calculate how much paint in the description. Make sure you check that out. But this is a very common mistake that homeowners make. They actually quit painting before the work is actually done. So they think that 2 coats is enough, but they find a thin spot, cover that up real quick, and the chance that there was just one spot that paint was thin is not great. If you're finding multiple thin spots, don't just do spot work or touch-up work. Just go ahead and add a 3rd coat. Paint is generally cheap enough. It's going to look better the more coats that you have on there. And if it's a weekend project, I absolutely understand. I've been there myself. It is worth taking the extra time and starting it on Sunday, and just knowing that it may take you until Monday or Tuesday evening to get it done and get it finished. So that is going to do it for me in the hot list. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening. If you have a question of the day that you would like answered, please feel free to shoot it to me, whether it's here on Facebook or you can drop it in the comments. It will get to me. I absolutely look forward to it. Again, I'm your host, Matt Johnson with Keller Williams Realty. I do this because your experience matters and should be trusted with a veteran. Y'all have a phenomenal day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.